O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Good afternoon to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I am the Director of the Helen Clark Foundation Mahiaronga. Before we launch into today's webinar, I'd like to invite Bridget McFlynn, Head of Marketing and Corporate Communications for our Foundation's strategic partner, WSP in New Zealand, to open the session with a short karakia. Bridget.
Kia ora, thanks Murray. Te hui, whaia, te maturanga, kia marama, kia whai, take ngā mahi katoa, tu maia, tu kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou kia tātou katoa, tihei, mauri ora. Which means for this gathering, seek knowledge and understanding, have purpose in all you do, stand tall, stand strong, let us show respect for each other. Thanks, Murray.
Kia ora, Bridget. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation, exploring the importance of engaging with communities when developing climate adaptations. I'd first like to acknowledge our wonderful partners at WSP in New Zealand, whose support and expertise helps us to develop serious solutions to a range of issues related to sustainable urban environments, including our most recent report, A Shared Future, the focus of today's webinar. As always, a very warm welcome to our Helen Clark Foundation members. Our foundation is an evidence-based, independent, non-partisan think tank, and we could not do this work without your support. As next month is our foundation's 5th anniversary, we'll be running a membership promotion through March. And if you've been thinking about joining our foundation, next month would be a great time to do so. If you visit our website, Helen Clark, that's all one word, helenclark.foundation, you can register for free email updates and we'll let you know once the membership promotion is live. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note that our foundation has several webinars coming up. The first will mark our foundation's 5th anniversary, and we'll see Helen Clark in conversation with former Prime Minister and constitutional law expert, Sir Geoffrey Palmer. That will be 12 p.m. on 19 March. And the second will be held at 12 p.m. on 3 April, and we'll explore long COVID, what it is, who it affects, and what we should be doing about it. So please keep an eye out for those webinars in your inboxes. And if you're not on our mailing lists, please do sign up. For those of you who haven't joined many of our webinars before, it's worth noting that this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off and there's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. As always, I would love for you to participate, however, and the best way to do so is to submit questions as they occur to you by entering them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can also like other people's questions by clicking on the thumbs up button, which means the question is more likely to be asked or put to our panelists. At around the 45-minute mark, we will put those questions to our panelists. You'll also see there is a separate chat function. We might use that section to put links during the webinar, but please put your questions into the Q&A area. Finally, we're always looking to improve our webinars and would love to hear your views on today's session. You should get a feedback form from Zoom in the next day or so, which takes about 2 minutes to complete. We read those all and take your feedback into account when designing future webinars. So that's it for housekeeping, but just before I hand over to our panelists, I'd like to mark the very sad news this morning of the passing of Afiso Collins, a Green Party MP, a former Auckland mayoral candidate and a principled and gifted leader, and to send our condolences to his family, to his friends and his colleagues. So I'll now ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Roana, then Gemma, then to Carly, who will go on to give us an overview of her excellent report before we get to the panel discussion proper. So Roana, over to you to start with the introductions, please.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Roana Bennett taku ingoa. No Te Whakaue, no Maketu Climate. Kia ora.
Kia ora, no Marawai o ka tupuna, kei o te tahi ahau, kei toku kāinga naenei, kei WSP ahau I mahi ana, ko Gemma Greenshields taku ingoa. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Just a little bit of a translation of that. I am from the deep south, down in Gore. That's where I grew up. I live in Christchurch now and work for WSP. My name's Gemma and I'm extremely passionate about communities and getting them wrapped around adaptation and the work that we do.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, karanga mai mihi mai, ko Carly Mercier toku ingoa, also from the deep south, Gemma not as deep as Gore from Dunedin, but living now in Wellington and Island Bay, luckily for me. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity of sharing the findings from the latest report with you all. Just by way of introduction, I think many of you may have noticed a sort of a shift in the past few years, especially since the massive floods and since Cyclone Gabrielle last year. I think the reality of climate change has really hit home for many people now. People are starting to get their heads around this really pressing need to begin adapting our lives and our communities to the real and ever increasing impacts of climate change. Some of the main impacts in Aotearoa, of course, and we're very susceptible to them here because of our geography. Some of the main ones are flooding, obviously, fires, slips and erosion, sea level rise, extreme temperature, droughts, and then, of course, increasingly wild and more frequent storms. So the impacts from climate change are going to touch on all aspects of our lives over time. They will in all likelihood affect where we live and how we live, how much our insurance costs if we can get it at all. They'll affect our communities, whether they are accessible, whether there's a road in and out. They'll affect our regional and our national economies, our infrastructure, our transport options, where we can grow certain foods, and so on and so on. And of course, all those big changes are going to affect our societies. So how we view them, whether we feel we have control over how they respond to these changes, whether people feel increasingly powerless or not. So that will impact our levels of social cohesion, which is essential to stability and to keeping democracy on an even keel. So that's why I find all of this a really, really important topic. You know, it's a huge and pressing question for all our communities, is how we adapt, and it's something I think that we put off discussing at our peril. But despite all that, I think overall my report is overall fairly positive. The aim was to present a useful framework for finding our way through those challenging times ahead. So what we really don't want to be is to be in a position where we're sort of having to mop up from increasingly dire and damaging disasters. Instead, you know, I guess a major impetus in writing the report was to build some energy and urgency for local adaptation planning, as well as to set out what best practice looks like. So I'm just going to share a bit of a slideshow here. Hopefully you can all see that okay. So firstly, just brief introduction to adaptation for those who are not sure exactly what's meant by the term. It refers to all those strategies and actions that are meant to help us build resilience to climate change, not to be confused with climate mitigation, which is about preventing or reducing emissions from greenhouse gases so that the impacts of climate change are less extreme. Both adaptation and mitigation, obviously, completely essential. Talking about adaptation doesn't mean that mitigation is any less important. So this PARA framework is used internationally and at home to explain the types of actions that can be included in adaptation responses. So we can attempt to protect buildings and infrastructure that are already there by building a seawall or a stop bank, for example. We can also avoid building or living in a certain place. I see they're still issuing consents for new homes on floodplains in Auckland. That is a great example of how not to avoid known risks. Sorry, a bit cheeky there. Another approach is retreat, which essentially means relocating existing buildings and infrastructure away from known risks. And then finally, we can try to accommodate risks. So there are loads of different ways to do that. Our recent Sponge Cities report, for example, talked about making cities more resilient to increasing rainfall events using green infrastructure. So that's things like planting wetlands, daylighting streams, planting green roofs and so on. That's an example of adaptation to existing or future risks. Other examples of accommodating risk might include things like creating barriers to prevent erosions or slips, creating fire breaks to prevent or to stop bushfires. And a long-term adaptation plan is likely to include all of those four things in some way, or components of all four approaches, perhaps staggered over time. So one example might be a community that's at risk of erosion and flooding from sea level rise. So they might decide that they're going to plant sand dunes as a short to medium term solution. They might think that they will build a seawall or raise houses on stilts as a medium-term solution. And then they might decide that they're going to plan longer term for existing houses to be bought out gradually by the council as a form of managed retreat. So then the speed at which those responses would be implemented would most likely be determined by predetermined triggers. So how fast is the sea level rising, for example, or how many times a year is the community experiencing flooding? So the question is, how are we doing in general, engaging communities in these long-term sort of strategic planning decisions? There have been some fabulous examples of best practice in adaptation planning, and there's quite a few case studies in the report if you're interested in having a look at some of those. Also, Roana and Gemma are going to talk about a couple in a minute. I would say there hasn't been a huge amount of implementation yet, but some good planning. Unfortunately, though, most engagement reported by authorities, by local authorities, tends to still be that sort of one-off consultation kind of engagement. So answering a specific question and not involving participatory engagement techniques, and not talking about those big picture strategic decisions. So I wanted to run through a few arguments for why it's crucial that we find ways to engage more meaningful with communities on adaptation. Just a quick note before I start. I wanted to acknowledge that councils are obviously under a huge amount of pressure from all sides at the moment. There are many, many reasons for local authorities to find this stuff challenging, or maybe they struggle to find the resources to do it well. So please don't take any of this as me having a go at councils. So one of the big issues for me is that current engagement processes are not particularly democratic overall. So where public consultation happens, it's more often than not an invitation to make a written submission. This process tends to sideline certain groups such as young people, people from lower socioeconomic groups, Pacifica and Māori communities, and other groups. So I don't mean to single out Auckland here. Auckland does actually do some really great work in community engagement, but I just happen to have the stats from Auckland, and I think these are reflected in the experiences from other councils around the country. So when they were doing their written submissions on their Auckland Plan 2050, submitters skewed really heavily towards being Pākehā, being older and being wealthier. The problem here is that those who are most vulnerable to climate change are often the least likely to engage in a traditional or conventional engagement process. They're also less likely to vote in local elections and to be represented on councils. I think this type of underrepresentation is particularly concerning in the case of climate change, because climate change is so complex, impactful, irreversible. Humanity, I think, has never had to deal with anything quite like this before, and the challenges are going to be unique. They will be long-lasting. The science is complex. The impacts will be unpredictable. They'll continue to evolve, and the impacts are going to affect us for generations to come as well. So all of that points to the need for increased democratic engagement around adaptation. It makes sense, I think, that it requires buy-in from everyone because it will affect everyone. Secondly, participation is super important in a climate of increasing mistrust. Climate change contains the potential to sow, I think, either great community division or cohesion, or more probably both, similar to what we saw maybe during the COVID-19 pandemic in that way. So there's been an erosion of trust in mainstream information by some groups in the past few years. There's also been an increase in conspiracy theories, as we all know, about climate change. These really leave the potential open for deep rifts to form around approaches to climate adaptation, and we need to try and avoid that as much as we can. So the good news in Aotearoa is that we still have relatively high levels of trust in our public services, and those levels have been going up over the past decade. That surprised me, actually, but I was very pleased to hear that. So we can keep building on that. Bad news is that most New Zealanders believe we are more divided today than we were in the past. So to maintain trust in governing authorities, communities need to understand the issues we're facing. They need to have a part in designing the solutions. That's going to be, in my view, just as important as getting the physical adaptation solutions right. Finally, next slide. Community engagement promotes equity and leads to better decision making. So the basic premise there of just transitions is that climate adaptation efforts should aim to reduce, not exacerbate, existing inequalities that already exist in our society. This means, for example, ensuring that those who are most affected by climate change are not only invited to participate in deliberations, but also that they're resourced to do so. I think that's really key. Another goal is to minimise maladaptation. As the name suggests, that means, or that refers to actions rather, that rather than leading to better resilience, actually have or make the outcomes of adaptation worse for some groups or for everyone. Good engagement can also improve the quality and durability of policy responses. Research points, for example, to community engagement leading to far more transformative and bolder recommendations and significantly better outcomes by a measure of about 4 to 1. So well worth it in terms of if you want to come up with a really good, durable, solid intervention for climate change for your community. Right, I'll just dip very quickly into the theory. This is the IAP2 spectrum of public participation, most widely recognised framework for public engagement internationally and at home. This spectrum goes from left to right, obviously, beginning with the lowest levels of participation, and then each step represents an increasing degree of community impact on the process. A key part of using the spectrum is that you would match the issue to be decided on with the right level of engagement. And the rule of thumb being that the more complex an issue is, the more there is disagreement on that issue, on the science, for example, and the more impact an issue will have on a community, the further towards the right you would want to be moving in terms of which kind of engagement process you selected. In other words, for climate adaptation planning, you would want to be aiming at least to involve the wider community, but more ideally, you'd want to be following a process of true collaboration or partnership, or even empowering the community to make some or all decisions themselves. Next slide. So the report covers the key principles for good engagement in a fair bit of detail, and there are many, many principles. I've just selected some of the top ones that I think are important here, but please do take a look at the report if you're interested to get the full list. There is no single recipe for community engagement. Sorry, guys, but some of the most important best practice principles include that decision makers should transition from a one-off consultation model towards developing long-term partnerships with communities and involving them in strategic planning. The goal should be a two-way dialogue, which means taking the time to listen to concerns. Oops, sorry. I seem to have accidentally pushed the wrong button there. Which means taking time to listen to concerns, to explain the science and to develop solutions together. The engagement must also be strongly grounded in the local community. This silly old thing has got a life of its own, sorry everyone. And to build on local knowledge and mātauranga. And it's also essential that all voices are heard, not just the most dominant, which I mentioned before. I think both Roana and Gemma are going to touch on those last few bullets a bit more in a moment, so I won't go into those in detail. The last but not least, in fact, one of the most important points is the importance of getting engagement with Māori right. Māori have a long history of facing natural hazards using mātauranga Māori, or traditional knowledge and wisdom. In Te Ao Māori, the health of the natural world and the connections that exist between all living things are of critical importance, and all aspects of nature are seen as intertwined and connected through whakapapa. So even for this reason alone, there is great value in ensuring Māori are involved in adaptation planning, even aside from the legal and moral obligation to make sure that it happens. There are also some really great examples of this happening, and also of iwi leading adaptation planning very successfully. However, the level of engagement between local authorities and mana whenua does vary substantially across the country. And the legal obligation to engage is set out under the RMA, Resource Management Act, and the Local Government Act. And really that just sets out a bare minimum requirement to consult, with not much detail given at all. And yeah, that's a problem in my view. So I argue strongly in the report that we need an update to our laws to ensure that robust engagement with Māori happens as a matter of course, and that Māori can be better supported to lead their own processes. There was going to be a sort of a beefing up of the requirement to engage with Māori under the new Natural Built Environments Act, which was passed last year but has now been repealed by the new government. So we do need some kind of something to replace that. The Climate Adaptation Bill was also being developed last year. I don't know where that's going to sit within the new government, whether they're going to continue with that or not, but we need some kind of that was hopefully going to set out, best practice for engagement, but I'm not sure now, obviously, where that is. So we'll have to wait and see. But we'll need some kind of legislative requirement, I think, in order to ensure that happens properly. Right. Oh, sorry, I should have said this. These are some conclusions from the Parliamentary Māori Affairs Select Committee that took place, a review took place last year on what best practice looks like in terms of engaging with Māori on climate adaptation. I won't read them out, you've probably read them by now. But as you can see, they set out a model of best practice that reflects a vision of empowerment with shared or delegated decision making being the ideal. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of my recommendations from the report before we switch over to the panel discussion. If you take a look at the report, there are many dozens of recommendations, and these are really just summarising some of the top ones. So it's a bit of an oversimplification. So please do check out the report for more. So I mentioned already, the first recommendation is we need to be getting ready for climate change urgently. We need to be engaging more meaningfully with communities as part of that process. And currently, meaningful engagement is not widespread or mainstream. So there's a lot to work on here. Again, I want to emphasise that I'm very aware of how hard this stuff can be for councils. They face increasing pressure to do more with less, especially the smaller councils, I think. And adding to that, public participation can be expensive, time-consuming, and can involve specialist skills. So it's not straightforward. And councils have expressed in various surveys how challenging they find the process, which is why we also have a raft of recommendations for central government, and I think their role should be to support local authorities. And before I look at those, I realise I haven't talked much about that last bullet, innovative approaches. My colleagues are going to do a bit of that, but I did want to highlight the great promise I see in deliberative approaches such as citizens' juries, where a representative group for an area is put together to make a decision on a certain topic. There was one recently in Wellington which looked to help the council make decisions around the priorities for its long-term plan, for example. And the thing I love about them is that they're a great way to take politics out of decision-making on policy. So I encourage you to read more and learn more about that if you're interested. Other approaches discussed in the report in terms of innovative approaches include things like the use of serious games, which NIWA's been doing a lot of research into. So people playing games, and that actually helps them express what their values are or what their dreams and visions are for their communities, and it helps them to understand some of the more complex science around climate change as well. There are also a range of different audio-visual tools and art and role play and so on as well. So yeah, as I said, we'll hear a bit more about that in just a sec from Gemma and Roana when they talk about their experiences. So lastly, recommendations for central government. So let me just check the time. How am I going? Good. Amazingly, I'm keeping within time this time. So central government will need to play a big role in ensuring that all councils are able to plan and implement adaptation approaches in a timely way. I think if they don't, then it may not happen. That's my worry. So the first big issue being that the size of a council does not necessarily correspond to the extent of adaptation work that they may need to undertake. So smaller councils may have just as many or more issues to deal with in some of the bigger cities, but their rate space is obviously a whole lot less. So West Coast is a great example of that. So I think that strongly suggests that some kind of central funding is called for some areas. We also recommend that central government support local council by funding research into community engagement processes, by promoting best practice and supporting capacity building for councils to help run effective engagement processes. And finally, I mentioned earlier that the law is currently lacking clear guidelines about what effective community engagement and adaptation looks like. When should it happen? How should it be paid for? So there's a gap there that needs to be filled in the legislation, or at the very least in some kind of national policy statement or in the National Adaptation Plan. Yeah, so that was, I guess, a bit of a whistle-stop tour about community engagement and climate adaptation. The report itself has a lot more detail, as I said. It also has lots of really interesting case studies and some really pretty pictures if that's your bag. So I recommend you take a look at that if you'd like to know more. So thanks for listening to my presentation. I'm really excited now to listen to hear what Roana and Gemma have to say. They're going to give us some real world examples from both from award-winning engagement processes that they've been involved with. So I will hand it over to you now, Murray.
Thank you, Carly, for that timely and very well-timed overview. So I'll ask our panelists, Roana and Gemma, to switch the videos back on, which I think they've done. So we'll now move into the panel session for today. And a reminder to our viewers to please enter your questions as they occur to you into the Q&A section below, or to vote on others' questions. We probably won't have time to get through all audience questions today, so if you see a similar question to the one you wanted to ask, please do vote for it. Today's first question goes to Roana. Roana, please start by telling us a little bit about the process that led to the development of the Maketu Climate Change Adaptation Plan. Why was a plan needed, and how did you go about developing one?
Kia ora no, Murray. We've been having climate change conversations in Maketu for over a decade. And so we had, none of those conversations had really taken in terms of being able to get a group together to start doing something concrete in Maketu. But there was an event a few years ago where we had koiwi, or bones, falling away from the cliffs, and we had another event, very heavy rainfall with some flooding, and that was like the wake-up call. And I think it's partly because we had those conversations earlier, even though they hadn't taken, that people were more receptive, and we got together and said, look, we need to do something about this. At the same time, you know, we knew that government and councils were starting to get themselves organised around climate change, and there were talks about plans coming out. And Maketu's like every small community. We really like our way of life. We don't like outsiders coming in to tell us what to do. So that was also a bit of an activator to get together and start determining our own future, rather than have the inevitable councils come in on consultation on their plans, but instead write our plans, hand it to them, and tell them this is how we want to do things in Maketu. So that was the impetus to get going. Around about that same time, our regional council, Bay of Plenty Regional Council, Toi Moana, we worked with them and were successful in securing a small community grant of $15,000, but it was enough to provide a focal point to actually get heads around the table. We chose to run an iwi-led process because that was something else that we felt very strongly about. We didn't want iwi to be an add-on to someone else's plan and someone else's focus. So we started off our process by getting our iwi collective together. Now again, we won't be unique in this, but we have quite a large number of different iwi who have an interest in our rohe. And we got together the ones that were ready and in the right space and had capacity, and we decided to lead out this process. So what we did, Murray, was we decided to run this, run 5 hui wānanga in a short space of time. We wanted to pressure cook this because we knew we needed to get momentum going to get our community activated. But we decided that of those 5 wānanga, the very first one should be iwi only. So that's what we did. We got our iwi together in our wharenui. It was a one-day wānanga, and it was an opportunity for us to talk about climate change, the potential impacts of climate change, get out some of the mamae that we had about it, some of the anger we had about it. You know, climate change is not a new kaupapa for iwi. It's part of that whole colonisation kaupapa that we've been fighting for generations. We've been telling people that this kind of calamity is going to occur if we don't change the way we do things. No one's listened. So there was a lot of anger. So that first hui was an opportunity for us to really get our heads around how we wanted to lead out this process as iwi. And we were also able to develop a values framework. I'll use the English word for it, a values framework, where we were able to set the values that would underpin the process moving forward. We then moved into our second hui, and the second hui was open to the whole community. And at that second hui, we dubbed it Climate Change 101. We got an external expert. He doesn't like to be called an expert, but he actually was involved with the IPCC for a period of about 10 years in the 2000s, and was one of the authors of the fourth report that ended up going on to be recognised with the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's in our region, Justin Ford Robertson. So we got him in to facilitate that second hui. So it was Climate Change 101. And the idea of that was to get everyone on the same spectrum in terms of their knowledge and understanding of climate change. We then went into our third one and our third hui. And at that hui, we invited all the agencies that had an interest in climate change or had data in climate change or were developing plans in climate change that encompassed Maketu. So we've got 3 councils that we work with in Maketu, 1 regional council, 2 city councils, and a number of government departments. And they brought their data to us and their strategies or plans, or wherever they were at with their plans to us, because we simply didn't have the arms, legs, time or patience to go around all those agencies and collect all that information. So we got them to come to us, and there's some pretty heated discussions. Many of the locals wanted to have a crack at the councils on things like drainage and you know, cemeteries and things like that. But we got through that wānanga, and we had a good kai afterwards, and a lot of good relationships were developed that have held us in good stead as we've moved along this process. The fourth of the 5 wānanga was our strategic planning day, and that's more what you would see in a typical strat kind of a session. You know, we had the whiteboards out, we had the post-its, we had the breakout sessions, the plenary sessions. So in that 4th session, by then we were all on the same page. We all had the data. People felt that they could talk openly about what was worrying them. And we came out with a lot of information, a very large draft document that we then took away. We refined, we took the draft around a few of the opinion leaders around the community, and then we came back to our final session, our 5th wānanga, put it back to our community, and it was signed off. And we had a wonderful celebratory lunch to finish that off. So that was the process that we followed, and we've come out with a plan that's, you know, it's on our website. So yeah, we felt that we did a good job of that.
Kia ora, Roana. Really interesting to hear about you know, the layered and bespoke approach you've taken in Maketu. I wonder if I could ask you to just briefly follow that up with some reflections on I guess what we absolutely need to get right when engaging with communities, and what you have seen as the biggest benefits and the biggest challenges to doing so before we move on to Gemma. Thank you.
I think that it's really important to hear what's important for a community. For example, our reo and our tikanga are central to our resilience. So those wānanga with kapahaka, those reo revitalisation wānanga, those tikanga wānanga, they're all part of that resilience building. It's not something that happens over there that's separate to community, separate to climate change. It's central to our resilience. Things like our urupa, our cemeteries, our places of cultural importance, that's our infrastructure. The infrastructure isn't just roads and pipes and drains. Our infrastructure include our urupa, our marae, you know, the things that are important to us. And I think by hearing what's important to the community, there's also a lot of learning for the agencies whose role it is to support us through these things. Like, for example, if there's a gully that's called Awaroa, the Long River, you can almost guarantee that in a heavy rainfall event, that gully is going to be a raging Long River. So, you know, I think that it's nothing is ever one way. And I think developing those relationships, being open and listening, I think that's absolutely critical to, you know, to a good process.
Kia ora, thank you, Roana. Gemma, switching to you now. You were instrumental in working with the community on the St Clair to St Kilda Coastal Plan with Dunedin City Council. Can you tell us what that was all about? What was the problem that needed fixing and the process you went through to develop the plan?
Thanks, Murray. Yeah, the Whakahika Raura ki Aotearoa Takitai, the St Clair St Kilda Coastal Plan, is a project that is very close to my heart indeed. And I was very, very fortunate to be able to have worked on that in close collaboration with the Dunedin City Council. So we worked closely with the community to put them at the heart of this climate adaptation journey and taking them with us to improve resilience for the future. And as Roana has said, it's more than just the physical things, but actually bringing community together in a way that they can talk within themselves to build some resilience as well. So the aim was to get community feedback early so that could guide the future technical work and the technical elements that have to happen at council, so that the council and the community were moving together in a similar direction. But there are some physical challenges at the coast. So there's one of a seawall at one end that's nearing the end of its life. There's in the middle at Moaroa, at the middle beach, there's a landfill which is very close to the dunes and behind the dune system, and they're facing erosion of that dune system as well. So we took time to meet with key parts of that community over 2.5 years, and the approach really involved listening to the community first. And that was key to understanding what was important now and heading into the future. And rather than overemphasizing the case for change or what the hazards in climate change were too early, it was really about that listening first. But there were a number of phases to our engagement. So over the 2 years, we talked about, and some of you may be familiar with the dynamic adaptive pathway approach and the wheel, where you start with talking about what is happening and what matters most, moving into what we can do about it, and then looking at concluding with a draft plan at the end of that process. But through the different phases of engagement, which we had 4 of, we were continually reflecting on who we were hearing from and more importantly, who we were not hearing from. So this meant that we were able to iterate and change our techniques to make sure that we were capturing the voices of that community. The community was diverse. There was a number of vulnerable people within the community that we also wanted to talk to. And just to give you a little bit of a lens on that too, it was during 2020 to 2021, which was incredibly difficult to get people together during a COVID pandemic. So we had a number of challenges that presented themselves to us. So iterating and reflecting on how comfortable people felt about getting together, having a multi-pronged approach so that people could also contribute online. And as soon as we could get out there, getting people together in the room was really important. One of the techniques that we found really useful was our printmaking sessions. So this is an arts activation that we got support from the University of Otago with, where people could come and create. The team could record meaning behind people's print creations, and we saw so many more families and whānau arrive at those events, young people, and those that could often find it difficult to express themselves through reading and writing could come and contribute to that process. So at the end of the coastal plan was focused on being also community friendly in terms of the way it was presented. So if you go online and you have a look at that document, it's not a traditional planning document. It's very colourful. It includes some of the community's prints within that. And we really very much wanted community to be able to pick up the document and be able to read it and see themselves within it as well. Bit of an overview, Murray.
Thank you, Gemma. So just like we asked Roana, I guess building on your experiences with the development of that plan, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit more about things we absolutely need to get right, the benefits. I think you've talked about the benefits to some extent already, but also perhaps some of the challenges that you faced.
Yeah, so I think organisations and agencies, and when you're working within the community engagement field, actually getting that commitment to do genuine engagement. So we were really fortunate to have that support in this process where we could genuinely say, I feel that this group is underrepresented, we need to go back and reach to them. We could reflect on what the community was also telling us. And like we had phases of engagement lined up, but we actually ended up changing that during our process. So we were going to go and talk about what was happening what was happening to the coast and what mattered to people. And then we're going to go into some solutions. But what we realized was in talking to people, it was a really big jump from talking about what they mattered and what they valued to then saying, right, these are our solutions, or this is. So we actually created another phase in there where we talked about broader management approaches, so holding the line, advancing the line, or mandatory alignment of that coast. So we started to be able to talk about approaches in a broad sense before we started to narrow and down, and that gave us a really good feel from the community about where they wanted the solutions to head before we went there. So the ability to do that genuine piece where you do have your project and you want to get to an outcome at the end of it, but actually listening to the community about where they are at and actually meeting their needs in that process is really important as well, because that allowed us to move together towards the plan development in the end. And one thing I would also say is that in creating the engagement plan itself, one of the best things we did was went and took time to do that with communities, with stakeholders, so that we could understand how people want to be engaged actually in the process itself. And one of the massive benefits of doing that was people could see us delivering a process in which they endorsed and they'd told us that they wanted to see. And so it wasn't waiting for outcomes to build trust. It was actually building trust in that relationship building as we went, and setting that out really up front was clear, because I think as a society and as a community, we all want to have a part in moving toward it to a positive place. And so people being able to influence how we went about the project was really interesting as well. But I mean, tapping into that printmaking, it was a huge benefit, but also just being out in the streets. I'm getting back to basics. We had some business cards where we went out and we were on the street trying to attract people to our events, and we were doing some surveys, and we're actually walking along the dune system, talking to the community about their values and views, because we also weren't hearing from people that visited this place, but it was also very important to them, even if they didn't live there. So we were out there trying to intercept them and grab them as they were doing what they did love to do at the coast as well. So challenges, as I've already said, about where the community's at and where the organisation might be at might be different. So that's one of the challenges we face in this work. And I think Roana talked about that too, around education being a really key part of this. So educating as we continually went along. And also the competing demands of organisations to try and get this work right. It's, there's an investment in energy, but also in cost to making sure that we do this properly and engage with our communities. So I often reflect on my own personal experience of disaster. So I been through managed retreat or red zoning as part of the earthquakes here in Christchurch. But I realised that some of this climate stuff isn't an earthquake. It's a little bit different, but the aftermath is very similar. And I just think about how we can help people with knowing that these disasters may be coming, get them out of harm's way or help them navigate that space. I'm really passionate about doing that in a way that allows people to express themselves, get out of harm's way, and hopefully not to have experienced the harshness and the reality of having to face some of the consequences of climate change, and then we can do so before we end up in a place where we haven't showered for a week and we haven't got dry homes to go back to. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is getting out and doing this work really soon before more of us experience that situation.
Thank you, Gemma. Really helpful and interesting to hear that nuance. Okay, so now we're going to enter we'll start addressing some of the questions from our audience today. Carly, because we haven't heard from you in a little while, I'll put the first one to you, and I think subsequent questions I'll just put to the whole panel, and you can choose to answer. So Carly, first question is from Tom F. With the current institutional and legislative framework, which I think you referred to being somewhat in flux during your presentation, what key lessons can you share about embedding the doing of adaptation in organisational BAU, such as within councils?
Yeah, I think it's not an easy question to ask, which is probably why you've asked it. Probably struggling. I imagine maybe you're struggling with that. I think that one of the big things is the importance of it being funded from central government where that's necessary, like especially for some of the smaller councils. I think one of the other key thing is the necessity of having clear requirements from central government about what's expected and when. I think that councils maybe need to have a bit of a mind shift about why it's important, why it's absolutely crucial. So some of the things we've been talking about today. So and then they need to realise that it's going to be ongoing. It's going to be a key part of their work for the foreseeable future. So they need to be resourcing that accordingly. What I'd really love to see would be something like capacity building going on around the country to help ensure all councils are upskilled so that they can actually carry this out really effectively and without all those uncertainties that they currently face about how it should work and what the best approaches to implement are. And one idea that I had would be for some of those more well-resourced councils to perhaps be sharing some of their learnings with others to make sure that everyone can benefit from the resources that they have and the specialist skills in this. But yeah, I don't think there's a straightforward process. I think it's going to be a gradual upskilling. I hope that people don't leave it until they have a personal climate disaster on their patch. That's the only thing. I want people to be thinking about, well, we might be okay for now, but we don't know how long that will be for. So we need to start thinking about this now, and we need to prioritize it, even if there's other, big things going on that need to be looked at. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks. Thanks, Carly. So next question I'll put to the panel in general, and please, any one of you come forward to answer. So this question is from Alex Keeble. How do you see citizen juries aligning with Te Tiriti or not? Do you think it's possible to enact Te Tiriti honouring adaptation in the absence of stronger constitutional or legal frameworks?
I will always advocate for iwi to be central to all of these processes. What's good for iwi is going to be good for the community that's around them. And many of the communities, particularly the smaller communities where there's a lot of interlinkages between iwi and the wider community, those communities would agree with that. For example, when it comes to climate change, the impacts of climate change, often iwi are the ones that are called on in the midst of a disaster to open up our marae, to provide kai, to provide warm, safe, dry place for people to stay. We can turn on a dime in terms of catering for hundreds and thousands of people. And I just think whether it's the emergency response or whether it's the environmental restoration, whether it's the comms going through the community and the networks, iwi have so much potential to contribute and lead on a whole range of issues that New Zealand's facing. So citizen juries, I can't comment on how you'd link in iwi into that type of process, whatever it might look like. But certainly if you have iwi at the centre, then a lot of everything else that people are trying to achieve will fall into place.
I can also add to that. So it's a really important point because a lot of the research around deliberative democratic approaches has been done overseas without that existing partnership requirement. So I think it's absolutely possible to do it. And I think there's been quite a lot of thinking done about this by groups that have already tried out a citizens jury. And there's also a citizens jury initiative being set up by iwi and Porirua, which is worth looking at. I think it's called the People Speak Climate Assembly. And the idea is that it's been established so that mana whenua and the people of Porirua can determine what a just transition is. So I think absolutely needs to be thought about. The thing about citizens juries is that they should be democratically or demographically representative, which means that if you had 5% Māori in an area, you'd have 5% Māori on the panel. But the important thing about that is to note that they wouldn't be representing all Māori voices by any means. They'd be representing themselves individually, and then you'd need another Māori voice or group set up that could represent the mana whenua voice. So yeah, I'm really excited to keep watching that space and see how we develop a really specific New Zealand model that incorporates the voices of mana whenua as well.
Great, thank you, Carly. Next question comes from Ashlyn Gallagher. How can you balance getting adaptation done now as communities are desperately needing and asking for, but also spending the right amount of time consulting, involving and collaborating with the community? So I think a question that goes to the heart of a lot of this stuff. Which panelists would like to take a run?
I can jump in
Gemma.
if you like, Murray. I was just going to say, really clearly articulating what the needs are for that community is paramount, right? So Roana talks about the wānanga that she ran in a pretty quite quick process, as is a little bit more protracted. But I think I can talk to my example where we needed a little bit more time because we were trying to do some technical work in between, and so we wanted the technical team to be able to be informed by the community and then take some of that technical work back to community. So we needed a little bit more time for that. So it really is the nuance of your situation, I think, in terms of how you prepare and plan, what the needs are, how big your community is that you're trying to engage, and whether you're setting up, say, for example, a citizens jury, and you might be able to get through something quite quickly, whereas we had quite a broad community that we wanted to meet with, and that was due to the needs for the council that we were working with at the time. So really about why you're engaging, who you're really needing to hear from, and who wants to be involved in it. And then, yeah, it's really how you shape that engagement in terms of what the timeframes and demands are for you in that space.
If I can just add a little bit to that as well, and I'll just talk, this is a Maketu specific kōrero. In our community, we have already a wide range of initiatives being undertaken that could fall under that umbrella of, climate change adaptation, climate change response. And through our process, we got those groups together and encouraged them to see the mahi that they're doing within a climate change framework. So as we were going through our planning process, our wānanga, these groups, that there were these groups, there's quick wins. They're already doing the mahi. They contributed their knowledge and understanding and experiences to the process. So it was kind of, iterative as we went along. And yeah, so there was sort of, it wasn't just a linear process. It was like all over the show. And through the process, we were able to come together and identify that this is what's happening. Let's encourage those people to do more of what they're doing. And there's some gaps over here, so let's perhaps encourage others to start in those areas. So yeah, it's an iterative process.
Thanks, Roana. And I guess continuing with you, we've got a question directed at you, again looking at Maketu. So coastal communities, this question comes from Renee Arawa. Coastal communities like ours in Tairāwhiti have had our wake-up call moment too. How was the process you've described resourced, and any recommendations to community groups for drawing down resource to enable these types of approaches?
The grant that we got from the Bay Plenty Regional Council helped us kickstart the process, partly because there's pūtea there that we could have for our hui, but also because it created a focal point to get us going. So in terms of pūtea, really all we needed in those initial stages was just sufficient money for the kai. One of my kaumata always used to say to me, if the kai was good, then the hui was good. And that is really, really true. So getting our caterers on board and getting the scheduling of the marae, having it at the marae, and because it was us doing it, and our pai was involved, there were no, the marae provided the facilities for us for free. So we managed to get a fair way just on a very small amount of pūtea. But the rest of the mahi that we've either done on a voluntary basis or it's been funded through some environmental type project funding that's come from central government, and we've got some relationships with some philanthropic organisations as well. So there's no easy answer to the funding. We would have spent, you know, well in excess of what the initial grant was by now. And I think that that is an issue that's going to need to be addressed, is where's the pūtea going to come from to help the communities move as far and as fast as they need to. So that's how we did things in Maketu. And yeah, probably no easy answer to the pūtea discussion.
Thanks, Roana. Okay, last question then for the panel before we wrap up today. Comes from Greg Stevens. The two examples given are great pieces of work, however, they both deal with communities with high current risks and therefore a greater understanding of the need to adapt. Wondering if the panelists think a different approach might be needed when dealing with communities that are not currently at risk but will face risks in the future. Does that require a different approach? Question to the panel. Who would like to take a run at our last audience question for today?
Look, I think any process where you're getting community together to talk about these things is a worthwhile process. Our Climate Change 101 wānanga was just, that's a sort of presentation that I would repeat in so many different communities, as long as it's coming from the community and it's with people that they're comfortable with. But taking people on that, a group of people, you know, when you talk about climate change with anyone, there's a continuum that they're on. They're, you know, for some, they're still at that climate denial end of the spectrum. For others, they're right, you know, they're the scientists that are writing IPCC reports, and everyone in between. And you'll get that in any group of people that you're talking to. So having climate change conversations, bringing information that's relevant, specific to the community, having community drive those conversations, and just bringing everyone along that continuum, so you're getting to a place where everyone's got like a common understanding of climate change per se, as well as how climate change may possibly impact on their community and their whānau. And I think that can happen anywhere and needs to happen anywhere and everywhere right now.
I'd agree with Roana, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges are these conversations aren't happening early enough. We need to be starting early so that we have got time, because I think there's some places where maybe these things are being rushed because time is ticking. And so I would encourage anyone who has the ability to influence that to get out and start talking to people early.
Carly, any final thoughts? To put you on the spot.
No, I thought that was very well answered by these guys. I would just say that it's not easy to change people's views on things, and sadly often it does take a big disaster to get people thinking. But I really hope that some of the big disasters that have happened recently and affected so many can spur everyone on to greatness. And yeah, that's pretty much my last thought on it. Please keep up the urgency as well. Don't just let it sort of drift into the past.
Thanks, Carly. A couple of reflections from me, having listened to today's excellent panelists. Just on the importance of listening to the community and listening first before getting into project specifics. On the concept, very well put by Roana, of reo and tikanga as being essential to resilience, and as and urapa and marae as being infrastructure in their own right. The importance of thinking about both who we're hearing from as we're going to take this work and who we're not hearing from, and what that might mean for the feedback that we're getting, and just underlying that all a commitment to genuine engagement. So thank you to our panel. That's the conclusion of today's webinar. We'd really hope to see you back for our next webinar on 19 March, when Helen Clark will be speaking with Sir Geoffrey Palmer. Please also keep an eye out for the feedback forms you should receive in the next day or so. To close out our session today, I'd like to ask Bridget McFlynn to return with a closing karakia. Bridget.
Murray. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he wā mauri ora. Cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened ear. a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious